Lord Turner, the Institute for New Economic Thinking has begun in this calendar year, and we'd like to get your perspective on its role and where it should be going. You inherited a tremendous amount of responsibility, a very important time in 2008 with the Financial Services Authority, and I guess we should start by asking, how did economists perform in the period leading up to and the eruption of the crisis?
Well, I think when you look at the financial crisis of 2008, you can describe a set of specific things that went wrong with the regulatory structure: inadequate supervision, poor use of credit rating agencies, bonuses paid for ludicrous risk-taking, unnecessary product development of exotic securitization structures, etc. But actually, you have to then step back and say, but why did all of that happen? And I think one of the reasons that happened was that we were in the grip of a steadily growing conventional wisdom of economics, which had taken from the neoclassical propositions of equilibrium economics and the efficient market theory and the rational expectations theory, an overly optimistic point of view that believed that provided you simply achieved low and stable inflation, and if you had free financial markets, everything would be fine. And I think this was a massive intellectual mistake which forgot or just ignored insights which were there back at the time of Keynes and had always been there in the totality of economics, but which got squeezed out, about the fundamental inherent tendency of markets to be subject to irrational herd effects or simply perfectly rational self-reinforcing cycle effects. I think the insights of Keynes, the insights of Hayek to different degrees, of Minsky, the insights which were in behavioral finance from people like Danny Kahneman were not part of the mainstream. And the mainstream did support, with highly mathematical sophistication, a conventional wisdom which I think caused harm. So I think you have to say that there was a failure of specific aspects of financial and central bank policy, a failure of specific aspects of financial regulation and the actions of regulators. But I think behind it there was an intellectual error. And as Keynes famously said, the world is driven by nothing much except ideas. Practical men who believe themselves entirely devoid of intellectual pretensions are actually driven by the ideas of some dead economist. And I think in this case they were driven by the ideas of alive economists, but I think we were led in the wrong direction.
Well, you've been working on these problems subsequent to the crisis. Has the economics profession learned a great deal from the errors that were revealed there? Are they back on track?
I think what's happened after the crisis is that economics is, in total, well aware that something went wrong. I mean, why did it not provide a better set of understanding of this disaster about to occur? Now, having said that, there were some things that economics got right in the crisis. The fact that we responded to it and didn't end up with a Great Depression of the 1930s actually was, to a degree, precisely because people had learnt the lessons of the 1930s. So some of the issues about how you deal with straightforward deflation, the appropriate form of intervention, you can see those as positives for economics. But I think in terms of the overall model of our assumptions about free financial markets, I think there's been a shattering, or there ought to be a shattering, of the self-confidence of the previous conventional wisdom. But as always in these circumstances, there are some people who are just circling the wagon around the existing dominant philosophy and saying, oh, well, if we just tinker around with some of the assumptions here and there, it'll be fine. Or indeed, following the old classic technique, which says, well, what this proves is we didn't have free markets enough. If only we'd liberalised more, if only we hadn't had the statist interventions of Fannie and Freddie, everything would have been fine. And I don't think that's good enough. And I think that's why the INET institution is absolutely vital. It is a way for giving energy and an organising framework and a pulling together of the great deal of good economics which was always there, but which I think had got, at least in the policy-making domain, pushed to the side.
Yeah. You have a great deal of responsibility. London, along with New York, are the major financial centers of the world. Is it not an anxious time to be in charge of regulatory policy when, you might say, the underpinnings of the theory in the diagnostic manual have been rendered somewhat invalid?
Well, you're absolutely right that I feel we are in a period now where we are trying to do what we pragmatically have to do to create new regulatory systems, to make a more stable financial system for the future. But we don't have a clear underlying theory of why a lot of things work the way they do. Now, the good news is we no longer have a delusion that we know things when we don't know things. I think we now know that we can't simply say, let's just leave it to the free market and everything will be fine. We can't simply say whatever the financial services do in financial innovation must be good, because if it wasn't good, it would have been winnowed out by free competition, which, broadly speaking, was the Greenspan doctrine, that somehow or other you didn't need to understand what all these CDOs and CDO squares and CPDOs were up to. They must be distributing risk in some efficient fashion, because otherwise the free market wouldn't have created them. Now, we know that that was wrong, and I think, but the thing is, we don't know what is right. We've got to return in lots of ways to a real world economics, which actually describes real institutions and real human behaviors, rather than getting away with a set of mathematically tractable but overly simplistic assumptions about the way the world is.
Roman Friedman, who's one of the scholars that works with INET, has said that we suffer from models which have the illusion of stability. Yet all of us now read Manias, Panics, and Crashes by Charles Kindleberger and the like. We can look and see that our theoretical models do not predict the kind of behavior that we've seen recur, this booms and busts cycle that George Soros and others talk about. And Roman said to me last week that we're in a period of Knightian uncertainty about economic theory.
Well, that's right. You're absolutely right. We are in a period of Knightian uncertainty about economic theory. One of the things we're certain about, however, is that a fundamental proposition is Knightian uncertainty.
That's right.
I think clearly one of the things that went wrong, both in the activity of policymakers and simply the risk management tools of major investment banks, was these extraordinary assumptions that you could just derive probability distributions from the past of the way that the economy operated and assume that that was the probability distribution of the way that it would operate in the future. And indeed to assume that if the historical results looked a bit tidy, you could just assume that underlying it there was a Gaussian normal probability distribution. This was a fundamental delusion. It was a delusion which helped give us models which we were capable of turning the mathematics on, but they've fundamentally ignored the basic insights of Frank Knight and indeed of Keynes in his treatise on probability, that the world is governed by deep inherent uncertainty. And we have to come to terms with that. Now, it is then unsettling, but it is quite startling that we developed economic models which simply couldn't describe phenomenon which clearly had occurred. I mean, you mentioned Kindleberger. Of course, you go back to Charles Mackay, the extraordinary public delusion, extraordinary popular delusions and the madness of crowds, who 150 years ago described the way that when you get a momentum and a herd effect behind a financial bubble, all these models of supposed rationality of individual people and perfectly operating efficient markets simply don't work. And I think the most crucial thing we've got to return to is focusing on the world as it is. Economics has got to describe the world as it is. It's got to, therefore, bring together models which attempt to understand as best possible what the world is. But if they can't explain real world phenomenon, they're not good enough. We can't sort of proceed on the basis of, well, you know, the real world phenomenon is not good enough for my model, so I'll sort of ignore the real world phenomenon. It has to be the other way around. And it is, I think, a major shift.
Yeah. What they call an inductive inspiration.
It's an inductive,
deductive.
yeah.
I've read some of your work recently. You were part of a report on the future of finance, and what interested me was that you're not just looking at the aggregate growth of credit, you're actually looking at the channels of credit growth and how they relate to productivity growth versus other types of bubbles in consumption and so forth. Are you envisioning a regulatory philosophy where, what you might say, we rather than relying on the interest rate across sectors, that we might need some additional instruments to deal with credit allocation?
I think if you roll back 30 or 40 years to the reforms of the way that central banks and finance ministries worked in the 60s and 70s, there was a junking then of previous quantitative tools, so that in the UK we gave up on having significant reserve asset requirements, we gave up on quantitative limits on credit, and we ended up with a belief that, first of all, the public authorities should never have a point of view on the sectoral composition of credit, and secondly, that the aggregate amount of credit was either not important, or if it was important, could be totally governed by this wonderful magic lever, the interest rate, which would keep the whole thing in equilibrium. I think that was a mistake. I think if you go to the insights of Hyman Minsky and others, you understand that there is something about credit extended against assets that have replacement value, above all against real estate. I mean, against stock equities as well, but the most important is real estate. They can simply get locked into cycles where the very process of extending credit is generating an asset price increase, which is therefore appearing to validate the extension of credit, encourage the more extension of credit, but is also generating profit on bank balance sheets, which appears to be generating the extra capital which makes the credit extension possible. And I think we have to understand these cycles, and we have to understand the way that they are particularly important in both residential real estate, but also commercial real estate. If you look at pretty much every banking crisis over the last 30 years, somewhere or other, really bad commercial real estate lending is one of the crucial bits of it. And that is driven by these cycles. Now, we need to understand that that's what we're dealing with. And that may imply that optimal levers need to include quantitative controls of credit, which do distinguish between different sectors of the economy. Now, what is interesting is, what I've just said, if I'd said it 5 years ago, people would have thought I was just a complete heretic against the sort of religion of the time. Because first of all, I'd said monetary policy is not enough. I've implied that monetary stability doesn't ensure financial stability, and that was point one of the conventional wisdom. And secondly, I've suggested that we might even take a point of view that you have to slow down commercial real estate lending, but not necessarily lending to manufacturing companies or leisure companies or whatever. So that is right outside the previous conventional wisdom or the religion. But I think it is where you are taken if you actually start by asking an empirical analysis. If you say one of the things that economics ought to do is just get out the data and say, what are these categories of credit? What are they doing? What fundamental function do we think they are performing? And if I observe their dynamics over time, what is that telling me about how they are locked in self-reinforcing cycles? I think that empirical focus, inductive, looking at the facts and then inferring stuff from the facts, is incredibly important alongside what was the over-dominant side, which was the let me establish a set of nice pure axioms and then let me drive a mathematical model based on those axioms.
One of the things that was revealed in the crisis is that many bankers said to authorities, particularly central bankers, you have to bail us out because we would take the real economy down with us. So they were acknowledging in the tension a spillover. But that spillover exists ex ante as well, or the potential of it. And the question of whether what they call externalities or spillovers is a infrequent phenomena or whether it's potentially pervasive would seemingly have a great deal to do with the regulatory regime that we would want to put in place as preventive medicine.
Well, there clearly are externalities. I mean, one of our core problems is that in finance there is a radical divergence between that which is in the interests privately of shareholders or of highly incentivized managers and that which is socially optimal. The managers and the shareholders will always want banks to be more highly leveraged than is socially optimal, because they are protected against the downside not only by limited liability but also by the realization that even the shareholders may not suffer full loss because there are large costs, externalities when they fail. And this fundamentally is why we have to regulate the capital ratios of banks, and I think it is both, have mechanisms whereby we can make make sure the biggest banks are resolvable in ways that impose losses on debt providers as well as equity providers. The fundamental challenge is, how do we create an environment where there isn't just a free put option onto the taxpayer, but do so in a way which maintains fundamental lending functions to the real economy? And this is a much more tricky challenge in financial institutions than it is in non-financial institutions. In non-financial institutions, we have well-developed processes of putting people into bankruptcy procedures. And what those bankruptcy procedures enable us to do in Chapter 11 and other mechanisms is to say, okay, we'll go off over here and we'll redo the capital structure of the company, while the actual company doing whatever it does can be kept going. And we'll impose losses on debt holders, we'll restructure it, we'll recapitalize it, and it'll keep going. The fundamental problem with banks is you can't separate the concept of the capital structure from the business, because the business of these things is money. The money that they owe to debt holders is part of the core business of it. And that's our challenge. And it does mean that, you know, we have really fundamental things to think about there.
Well, it seems that what you might say, the people who were benefiting from that system were also people supporting academic institutions.
Yeah.
And one of the feelings at INET is that we are in the business of providing public goods.
Well, I think that is actually the core of economics. Good economics is a great public good. It is fundamentally dealing with what are the things which are socially optimal in environments where pure private behavior, wouldn't deliver social optimality. I mean, if the propositions of complete free market economics were correct, we don't need economists, because everything would be sort of panglossingly perfect in any case. We precisely need good economics to understand when the great power of the market and the creativity of the market won't work, where it won't work, where there are fundamental market imperfections, where there are bad incentives, where there are bad structures, where there's a difference between social optimality and private optimality. And it's very important that we have well-funded institutes of economics and departments of economics which are designed around and committed to that principle, that that's what they're about. And one of the problems I think we do have in economics is that it can get skewed also by the private interests. I mean, here, for instance, is a problem. A very significant proportion of everybody who is a professional economist outside the universities, where do they work? They work in the financial services industry. Now, these are good people. I've got nothing against them. I'd be perfectly happy to let my daughter marry one, or let them move into my street. You know, I'm not prejudiced against these financial services economists. But they're only human. They will, even though they will be perfectly honest in what they do, they will tend to end up with a point of view which tends to support the interest of the industry that they were in. Or they will certainly not, strongly argue against it. So it is very, very important that we have countervailing point of views and that we have good, strong funding for institutes which are committed to deliberately go against the conventional wisdom or to go against the form of economics which will serve the interest of, the dominant players in financial services. That's an important part. That's an important part of a public good.
We talked about this in the context of Knightian uncertainty, as we have talked about the return of Knightian uncertainty, the growth of the Asian economies, the move from the G8 to the G20, and other structural changes. That this is a very vital time to have those challenging and robust debates about economic theory, because we are at risk on this planet of dysfunction.
We are at risk at dysfunction, and I think dysfunction in the economy is incredibly important. I mean, let me give you a slightly different thing we haven't mentioned. There was an interesting debate about how important is the last bit of growth for human welfare. There's an interesting bit of economics about whether we ought to be fixated with growth in already rich societies. And that's a very interesting debate, which was one that interests me, and I think we sometimes allow ourselves to be over-fixated by growth. But what is absolutely clear from the same research that tells that is that human beings' welfare is hugely upset if they get setbacks to already attained wealth. It's hugely upset if they become unemployed. It's hugely upset if they've already attained a certain standard of living, and then it's upset. So one of the things that we should really be aiming at in economic policy is to make sure that we do not have sudden shocks to the system which get these big setbacks. And of course, if they're really big setbacks, they can drive terrible political developments. I mean, that was the story of 29 to 33, that these setbacks were so big that they then became politically important. They drove political extremism. So really working out what makes an adequately stable global financial system is crucial. Now, our key focus, I think, should be, in terms of human welfare, we're trying to create systems in which the market economy, people's creativity, can, first of all, deliver prosperity for those countries that haven't got there already. Growth is clearly terribly important for emerging markets. And in the rich developed countries, simply allow expression to human freedom, and it will produce a certain level of growth. Whether that's really, really important once people are rich already, who knows? But we want to be creating a stable environment within which we can allow expression to human creativity on the really important things of life. I was struck the other day, Keynes, I think in 1931, I can't remember the precise words, but he used these words in about July 31. He said, we have blundered in the management of, we have made a colossal blunder. We have failed in the management of a complicated machinery whose workings we hardly understand. And I think, that is true with, fortunately, less catastrophic effects in what happened to the financial system in 2008. So understanding how this incredibly complicated thing called the global financial system works, and continually working how to offset its tendencies to instability, tendencies which will show themselves in new forms in 10 years' time. It won't be a repeat of 2008. It'll be a new variant of some other instability. This is a crucial area of huge importance to human welfare, and something on which good economics has, an enormously powerful ability to contribute.
You spoke of the shocks, the unanticipated shocks and downturns, and how unsettling they are, and how they can unleash extreme politics. But within the economics profession, which was riding very high, this crisis perhaps has taken their reputation for a downturn and makes them fearful.
Yes, I agree. I think what we've realized is that a lot of the existing dominant models of economics did not provide a good explanation of what occurred or forewarning of what occurred. And there could be a tendency for some of economics to say, well, we were never meant to do that, ever. You know, this is a pure play, this is a bit of pure play mathematics. You know, what we're about is elegant models, and, you know, we get the high prizes because our models work. I don't think that's good enough. I think the essence of economics is that it has got to realize that it has a social mission to help us understand issues of vital importance to human welfare, both in positive respects, but also in preventing harmful negatives. And to do that, the fundamental thing it has to start with is bringing together theory and empirical observation of what actually occurs. Bringing together theory and models and deep understanding of specific institutional setups through which overall economic variables have expression. So monetary policy cannot possibly be a sensible thing unless it involves deep understanding of the real dynamics of actual banks. Otherwise, it just isn't explaining what it's got. And it's also got to explain the real dynamics of markets, not rational expectation hypotheses, which just assume that people have rational expectations, but both the insights of the behavioral finance group, the people like Danny Kahneman, the behavioral psychology, and the insights of George Soros himself and people like Roman Friedman, who have looked at the way that even if people are individually rational, they can be locked into cycles of self-reinforcing behavior which produce deeply disequilibrium overall effects. These are all incredibly important things that we have to look at in order to be able to answer really important questions for human welfare.
Well, first of all, in 1938, Keynes himself wrote a letter to Roy Harrod, and he talked about economists, and he said there are two talents. One is that of building the abstract models, and the other, which is much more scarce, is that of vigilant observation and the selection of what is the right model. And I want to say to you, thank you for joining us today, because I do believe, whether it be the financial regulation or the product of economists and intellectuals, you are a vigilant observer, and we very much value your perspective.
Good. Thank you very much, and the best of luck.